Thank you, Ebony. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks to the Australia Institute for your continuing work on revenue and a more just society. I pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, elders past, present, and all First Nations people here, and I acknowledge the particular pain right now for First Nations people all over our continent. I'm in the Parliament because of the climate crisis. For me, it's all about the planet, and there's no economic justice, which I've spent my life working on a dead planet. There's no justice for First Nations people, there's no gender justice on a dead planet. So for me, since arriving in the Parliament, there's been no good news on the climate issues. We have a government that continues to open and extend coal and gas mines, fuelling that catastrophe, and I believe that future generations will hold us to account, as they should. I think there is no argument that our country faces incredible challenges, very, very big challenges, and many of them are going to cost a great deal of money. They extend, of course, to the climate crisis itself. We see today fires, loss, many floods, droughts, storms all over our country and the world, drought, massive changes in weather systems. We see future health crises, no doubt, ahead, and we need to spend a great deal of money narrowing, closing the gap and for First Nations justice, not to mention funding the care system, which we were just hearing about, whether for aged care, disability, childcare, and paying our carers decent money and giving those who care the kind of leave that they need, including at least 12 months paid parental leave with superannuation. A revenue summit is not surprisingly focused on generating revenue to meet those needs. And let's face it, there are some very lucrative pools of revenue available to Labor, especially if it wants to narrow inequality, if it wants to fix the housing crisis, or if it wants to ensure that our defence spend gives us practical options and value for money. A government aiming for these things would dump stage 3 income tax cuts, which would give us $313 billion, of course, over the next 10 years. The capital gains tax discount would be dumped. It'd save $7.6 billion. And the negative gearing deductions, which would give us $4.8 billion. Together, those two housing deductions would really make a difference to the housing crisis, which is very, very powerful, affecting the lives of so many people in the state where I live, South Australia. Doesn't matter what country town, what part of my city you go to, there are people in desperate need of housing facing massive rental increases. And then, of course, there are the nuclear-powered submarines, where the government is talking about spending $500 billion on a very small fleet of submarines, with many, many challenges between them arriving, and very high probability that they're going to cost us a lot more than the $313 billion that the more than $500 billion that they're looking at the present. However, there are other ways to meet our revenue crises, not just through increases or changes on the tax side. We can, in a time of crisis and change our spending and change the way we spend and the efficiency of what we spend. And that redistribution of expenditure is a really important part of dealing with this challenge that we face. And I want to spend my few minutes on that side of the discussion about revenue. I came to the Senate a refugee from the university system. I was a research leader, and I faced many layers of competitive evaluation on the way to winning very modest grants, usually a few $100,000 for several years of research on matters that I thought were really important. Grants that were subject to multiple levels of probity and audits. Try and spend $20 of an ARC grant on anything without a receipt and you won't get very far. I don't think I ever had a free lunch on an ARC grant. I probably would have been jailed. The climate catastrophe brought me here into the Parliament, but in politics you have to surf the waves that are coming at you. And who knew that that would be the extraordinary behaviour of the Big Four consultants, ranging from their voracious and aggressive behaviour in assisting the world's biggest multinationals to avoid paying tax, to the extraordinary and unaccountable farming of the public dollar to line their personal pockets, especially the pockets of those at the top of the Big Four, those earning millions of dollars a year in opaque partnerships replete with conflicts of interest that are aggressively harvested where personal gain trumps public interest at every turn. But this is the wave that I find myself confronting at present, and that's the wave you have to deal with. So I'm shocked every day, and I want you to share my outrage. I'm hoping that the outrage of the Australian community can help drive change. We're looking at state capture on a massive scale, one that makes the international texts by people like Mariana Mazzucato and Rosie Collington pale into a historic significance. They are important texts, but we are now an Australian international case study of being harvested aggressively by a small number of very big consultancy entities. There are many books to be written about the Australian experience of this past year, and there are many Harvard case studies in how not to manage it, including PwC's failure to frankly deal with its ethical and leadership failures, let alone the consequences of those failures for the thousands of workers who work down the ladder in those firms, in PwC and in the other Big Four, who are often paid very modest amounts for what we now know to be very, very long hours and other very challenging conditions, quite high levels of sexual harassment, of bullying and other concerns about their conditions. There is a beautiful Buddhist phrase called beginner's mind. It brings a beginner's mind perspective to whatever you're doing, whether it's meditation or being a senator. And I certainly have brought a beginner's mind to this work amidst the Big Four and in coming to grips with the nature of our tax and spending system. My first Senate estimates introduced me to multi-million-dollar labour market programs that had no evaluation. We have no idea what many of our labour market programs in the last decade, have delivered. From then I graduated to puzzlement at multi-million-dollar projects that never went to tender and too often simply failed to be completed. No outcome, no output. Who can forget PwC's 8 PowerPoint pages on robo-debt, which cost $1 million and which I think now they have promised to pay back. They feel the shame of that, and our government should feel the shame of that failure. But we now live in a world of almost daily revelations about the billion-dollar world of big consulting where the big bucks and really significant savings lie. In this world, public interest, value for money, ethics and conflicts of interest fall at the first hurdle when it comes up against the whatever it takes business model of the Big Four. This is a world of very big money. A public audit of the APS workforce found that the Great Australian 21st Century Consultant Fest peaked in 2021-22 with the coalition government spending of $20.8 billion. This includes hire of external labour, consulting, travel, advertising and legal costs. This is equivalent to 54,000 jobs in the public sector, and the Australia Institute's own research has been provided to the Senate around this issue. This is a shadow workforce of 37.5% the size of the existing public sector. And there is more. I'm just pointing to the absolute straight payment from the public sector into private consulting and contracting. I'm not going to go to a whole range of other matters which also deserve your outrage. For example, and I can't help myself not mention the fact that in recent days, in the last few days, we have gained some insight into the tax settlements that are made available to Australia's biggest and some of the world's biggest multinationals when they go off the rails and don't pay their tax properly, to the tune, 75 of them last year, of over $5.4 billion, they get a reduction on that tax tax payment they should be making by 44%. So they paid $2.4 billion of tax that they paid. I have a minute to go and I have a little more to say, so sorry. Mustn't go off my script. But the point is, the average nurse out there doesn't give the tax ATO a call when they get a bill for $1,000 they owe the tax. They don't line up a case in the court to contest it. They just write the cheque or send the money. The big end of town contest the collection of revenue in very significant ways that make a big impact on revenue. We owe this massive increase in public spending into the private sector to successive governments. Labor have certainly played their role historically, but John Howard really led the way by denigrating the public sector, and in recent years, of course, we've seen a cap on spending, but the ideological attack on the public sector has got a deep history in our country. Over the past decade, the value of Commonwealth procurements from KPMG, Deloitte, PwC and EY jointly has increased by over 400%, from 282 million in 2012-13 to over 1.4 billion direct consultancies in 2021-22. In too many places, our public sector has been actively farmed for profit. It's been captured by external interests and ripped off through poor value for money, and it's been saturated with ideology that favours private interests and works against the public interest. It has been a deeply shocking experience, as I said, and one that I'm not alone in finding shocking. So read, for example, if you're interested in this issue, the joint unanimous report on PwC to the Senate called A Calculated Breach of Trust, which unpacked what actually went on in PwC, a continuing unpacking that is unfolding. All senators across the Greens and both major parties have shared this shock, and I can tell you many, many thousands of Australians are also sharing that shock, and they want change. The Big Four are the high priests of privatisation and a model of a model of business that is reap revenue at all costs, all behind closed doors, all opaque, and with structures of very large partnerships where people at the top take home a lot of money. Mr Luke Sayers, who was in charge of PwC for 8 years when all of the matters where they monetised confidential government information to assist the world's biggest multinationals to avoid tax, he was in charge all of that time. Under his leadership, he says he has no knowledge of what happened there. He was also in charge as tens of thousands of legal professional privilege claims were mobilised to keep behaviour within PwC opaque and not visible to the tax office. He has suffered no penalty. He took home $30 million in that 8 years. The richest consulting and contracting terrain is in the world of defence. 76% of the total spend in that peak year of 2021-22 was in defence. It amounted to $15.7 billion in 1 year. That's equivalent to 34,000 jobs in the public sector. And KPMG is especially active in defence. This is a real concern on many fronts, certainly around integrity and certainly around the black box of where those dollars are going and with what consequences. So what have we learned? Let me briefly summarise the few things as I move towards the recipe for change. We've learned that our world is littered with examples of 7 kinds of misbehaviour. Firstly, rampant farming of conflicts of interest. Most obviously, some years ago now, but McKinsey paid $6 million, for example, to write the Morrison Net Zero plan over the top of the CSIRO, while also consulting to 43 out of 100 of the world's biggest fossil fuel polluters. Secondly, there's a very deliberate strategy afoot in so many places of land and expand. Get in, get your first contract, give a low price on it, lowball it, and then multiply it by 6 as you go through. Thirdly, and most profitably, farm variations. Having got a $3 million contract, tell those public servants actually work's not done, we need another $3 million and so on. The consulting industry, and there are many people horrified within the consulting industry about what is going on, and they are on the phone to me and the other senators telling us. So farming variations is the most profitable thing you can do. Fourthly, there's the matter of the revolving door, that is the rapid movement, large movements of people from the public sector into consulting. This is very actively managed. KPMG, for example, in the last 5 years has recruited 100 people out of defence, and that has certainly underpinned a massive growth in their contracting. Fifthly, the question of walking both sides of the street. There are consulting firms which advise government on how to regulate aged care. They have many clients in their client list who they assist to meet those regulations, and in some cases they even very helpfully help the government actually police the regulations. So it's walking 3 sides of the street. Sixthly, there is a massive capture of advisory structures at work in many parts of our government, not least in our tax structures and in our regulatory bodies. I think that what we need to do in relation to the capture of many elements of a government advice and structure is to end that infiltration of a whole range of government bodies. And finally, there's a straightforward capture of government in the form of donations to major parties, which a number of the big consultants do at length. So, in my view, with all of those factors, outrage is appropriate. Please share mine and think about, let me offer some ways in which we need to change things. We need to put the public interest at the centre of public spending. It's a simple proposition, but it's really important, and it's been grossly polluted by behaviour over the last decade in particular. We need to root out opaque profit seekers who rip off the public purse and are simply, in some cases, extraordinarily greedy, if not outright corrupt. We need to put the APS back in the driving seat of public work, where only they are able to deliver the kind of work and activity that will meet the public interest. And this means regrowing that public sector is not a simple project, but it means we must restore strong leadership to the public sector. We have had strong leadership in the past. We do not have it at the moment, and it's incredibly important. We have to improve the working conditions of the public sector so that they are model working conditions, not just in pay, but certainly pay, in terms of leave and in terms of working time, so that our public sector becomes the employer of choice in the way that many young people, until recently, have looked at the consulting sector as an opportunity. We need more staff, many more staff, and more skilled staff. We need to cut back consulting, we need to track it, and we need to set targets, and we need to hold senior leaders in our public departments to account in relation to them. We need to regulate consultants in a new way. They're completely unregulated at present. There is no professional body, there is no regulatory structure. If you're a tax agent giving tax advice, there is a tax practitioners board that holds you to account. Nothing for consultants. And we need to break open the structure of those very big firms which have audit sitting alongside consulting, and they harvest one for the other, built-in conflicts of interest. Finally, we have to end donations and state capture. When we talk about revenue, we have to talk about tax and who pays it, but we must also talk about how the government spends its money. The crisis that we're in represents a real opportunity. People are scrubbing the big four off their CVs. They are a bruised brand, and that is appropriate. If you want to read some detail about it, have a look at Elizabeth Broderick's report about what it's like to work inside EY. Or have a read of Swikowski's review of PwC and the dominant way in which the business model drives poor employment practices and unethical business models. We need to do this, we can do it, and we must do it because Australia's diligent, honest taxpayers, all the nurses, the electricians, the retail workers, the childcare workers, the cleaners, they rely on us not only to collect revenue fairly, but to spend every dollar of public money wisely on things that make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and a very special thank you to all our supporters who help keep us running. We're not funded by political parties or fossil fuel companies or government, but by people like you who know the importance of evidence-based research in shaping the critical decisions facing Australia. If you'd like to support us to continue exposing inconvenient truths, challenging vested interests, and explaining the big issues in plain English, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution today. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au to find out more.